Hey everybody, welcome back to the SuperBake podcast. I'm your host, Baker. Let's talk about stuff. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. So for tonight's episode, I thought that I would give my review for the entire second season of Invincible, mainly part 2. I might do a quick recap on part 1, or at least talk about it briefly as I talk about this. I know last time I talked about, I think I divided each episode into two Invincible episodes. This time I'm just going to talk about the last 4 episodes altogether. It was just kind of easier for me. This is also going to be kind of off the cuff. I had a few notes that I wrote down, but for the most part, this is going to be an off the cuff review. Also, this is going to contain spoilers, so if you haven't seen it yet and you don't want to know what happens, consider this your warning. So, part 2, first of all, I'll give kind of my overall opinion of the second season of Invincible. Overall, I would say, while I really enjoyed it, I do think that season 1 was probably my favorite of the two so far, mainly just because I think season 1 felt more like a cohesive story. Season 2, it definitely feels like there's a lot going on, and I definitely kind of felt that in the second half of the season. In the first season, it felt like while there were side stories going on with some of the other characters, like Cecil, the Guardians, Debbie, it felt like most of it was kind of centered around Nolan and his persona as Omni-Man, and kind of the mystery behind why he did what he did, what were his motives, what was he going to do, and then of course it kind of led up to the ultimate final confrontation between him and Invincible, and that was kind of the main focus of season 1. Season 2, overall, it kind of feels like it feels like season 2 is operating more of setup for the next season, for the big fight that's supposed to come next. Because it's very clear watching this that there's obviously bigger confrontations that are coming down the road, and it kind of feels like season 2 is setting up some of those pieces for those future conflicts, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it does kind of lead to some of my issues with season 2 that I'll kind of get into a little bit. But as far as the second half of the season, I think I pretty much gave mostly positive reviews for the first 4 episodes. The second 4 are also just as good. The first half ended with Mark and Nolan's fight against the 3 Viltrumite soldiers, and we kind of got to learn a little bit more about what Nolan was up to on Araxia with the bug aliens. And then we get to see the aftermath of that battle. Nolan's been taken by the Viltrumites, including their General Krieg, and Mark has basically been left with the task of assuming Nolan's position on Earth as the Viltrumite infiltration soldier, basically supposed to get it ready, which of course we all know Mark's not going to do. I think I've said this before, I really like Mark's character, and it is sad to see him just continuously just get saddled with these awful decisions that he has to make. Now he's got to go back to Earth with the bad news of trying to figure out how to balance his life, but also living with this knowledge that the Viltrumites are inevitably coming. And also it's an army of people basically about as strong as Nolan, if not stronger. And we all saw how the fight between Mark and Omni-Man went at the end of season 1. So yeah, the guy's definitely got his work cut out for him. Also, as a side note, I did find when he took his little brother Oliver with him, it was actually a genuinely sad moment where I can't remember the name of or Thraxen. Did I say Araxian? Thraxen. The Thraxen mother, I can't remember her name. I know she's played by Rhea Seehorn, but her farewell to Oliver, that was a genuinely touching moment. And I think it definitely shows how dedicated the writers are to these characters. This is the Thraxian mother, we're not going to see her again throughout the rest of the show, at least not to my knowledge, because they have very short lifespans, as they point out in the series. So despite all that, it actually still is a pretty sad moment where she has to say goodbye to Oliver and let Mark take his little brother with him to Earth. And then we get to see Mark kind of try to reintegrate himself back in college, try to get his relationship with Amber back on track, as well as his job with Cecil, trying to explain things to him. And like I said before, just trying to balance his life, trying to figure out where does he go from here. I feel like it definitely reminds me a lot of Spider-Man. But I definitely think one of the things that Invincible has done very well, in my opinion, is showing the the challenge that comes with being a superhero. Like, I feel like other superhero stories sometimes touch on that a little bit. Like, there's a little bit of that where you see them you see the balance of them trying to be a regular person, but then also trying to be assume their superhero persona. But I kind of feel like it's kind of, it feels like in other stories, you kind of have to sacrifice one for the other. Like, which one do you focus more on? I feel like Invincible does a pretty good job of balancing both. Like, we see Mark in his regular life, but we also see him as Invincible. Like, we see his struggles with college, where he's trying to explain to the dean about his slipping grades. We get to see how he tries to balance, like, basically his job of being a protector of the earth and taking over Omni-Man's position, and how being a superhero basically becomes almost like a full-time job for him, in many cases, like more than a full-time job. And I think the show does a really good job of showing that balancing act. And I definitely think Mark is kind of he's the emotional core of it. And I think it wouldn't work as well if he wasn't such a likable character. Like, you genuinely root for the guy, or at least I do. Something I definitely want to point out about this season too is that it really has done a good job of giving other characters a chance to shine. Two that really stand out in my opinion are Rex Splode and also Donald's character. Like, these are two side characters that in season 1, to be honest, I didn't really think a whole lot of. Donald kind of seemed like more like this, I would say almost C or even D plot character, like in the background. But with learning more about his identity as like an android, and then seeing like the trauma that he's gone through, learning that he's died multiple times in the past, and that now he's basically a freaking Terminator, it leads to a pretty heartfelt scene between him and William and Rick. And that was a scene that I was not expecting to be as emotionally invested in as I was. So yeah, like that was a standout for me. And then Rex Splode, man, dude, he was like MVP for his part in this season. Now that I'm kind of getting into that, I do kind of want to bring up one of the problems I have with this season, and particularly part 2 of this season. And that is that it really has kind of felt like the stakes have not been quite as high as they were in the first one. Like, in season 1, characters died, and it was often brutal, and they didn't come back, with the exception, of course, of Immortal. But in this season, so there's a scene where the Guardians and Mark have to go to Mars to fight the Sequids from the first season. So it's like Mark, it's Eve, Immortal, and several others. Most of the main superheroes have to go up there to deal with it. But then Rex Splode, Shrink Ray, and Duplicate stay back to basically to hold the fort down while the others are gone. And then, of course, in typical fashion, things go horribly wrong. The Lizard League attacks some base, and then Rex Splode and the others have to go stop them. And it leads to what is... I'm kind of torn about it. It is one of the most brutal fights in the show thus far, and yet nothing really ultimately happens when you think about it. Well, not nothing, but it definitely felt like the stakes felt lower as a result of it. So I'll kind of get into what I mean. In that scene, it shows the Lizard League is like, I don't remember their names. Like, I think that the joke with them is they're kind of supposed to be sort of like nothing villains, but in this one, they're actually kind of threatening. But like, there's a scene where Shrink Ray and Duplicate, essentially, it looks like they get killed by the big guy. And it's like such a oh shit moment. And then suddenly Rex Splode is like outnumbered, but he somehow manages to take down both the big guy, even though he gets his hand chomped off, which was a brutal scene. And then he takes out their leader, which was both brutal and also funny. Like, he literally beats him to death with his stump of a hand. And then he also gets shot in the head. And you really have to suspend your disbelief in that scene. It's like, okay, I get it. He's a superhero, so you could make the argument that Rex is maybe a little bit more durable than other humans, but as far as I'm aware, there's been no indication in the show that he can survive a shot to the freaking head. And somehow, not only does he survive this, but he's basically fine like an episode or 2 later. Like, they fix him up, he has like cybernetic limbs attached, he even gets this cool little hand cannon for his hand that got chomped off. And not only that, but like, Shrink Ray survives despite getting eaten by the big lizard guy. And then Duplicate, again, who, despite thinking that she's dead, and I don't remember if I predicted this or not, but I think I predicted that funeral in the trailer was Duplicate's funeral. It is in this. But of course, the big reveal is that she's not actually dead. She kept a copy like in a remote location that the Immortal eventually finds. And she says she does that as like a safety precaution in case something happens. I will give them props for that. That was a smart move. And I feel like that's something that you wouldn't see a lot of superheroes do in other shows. I was like, yeah, that would make sense. If your power was to make copies of yourself, it would make perfect sense that you would keep a backup somewhere just in case, someone killed you. So while I do think that was a smart move, on the one hand though, when it was all said and done, I was like, okay, so basically that just means that the Lizard League got their asses kicked in that scene. And there really were not any repercussions. I mean, granted, Shrinkray got badly injured, but I don't know. I couldn't help but think like maybe there should have been a major death there. It definitely felt like Rexplode at the very least should have died in that scene. Now, granted, I have not read the comics, but I do know for the most part like what happens, at least the broad strokes. So I know what happens to Rexplode in the comics. So I mean, knowing that, I guess I'm okay with it. It's just, I don't know. It felt like a lot of the weight from that scene kind of got taken out of it when you learn that Shrinkray and Duplicate survived. Like, all three of them survived that fight, and all the Lizard League members got killed. So, or at least as far as I'm aware, it seems like they did. It felt like that fight in season 1, people's asses would have been gone. So, I don't know. It kind of felt like the stakes were kind of low in that fight, in my opinion. So that was kind of one issue that I kind of had with this season. Another issue that I had was, and this is something that I kind of wanted to talk about too, is kind of the main baddie of this one, Angstrom. Now, one thing I definitely want to stress is that I don't have a problem with Angstrom as a character. As a character, I think he is fantastic. I think he's a very interesting, kind of a tragic villain. And seeing like how he came to be like in the beginning of the first half of season 2, when he's working with the Mauler twins, like, you see like his grotesque form where he's like all mutated from like the different alternate versions of himself, basically absorbing them. And you kind of see like the end result in this. The biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems I think I have with this season, is that we don't really get a whole lot of him. He's in the first episode. We get a little bit of him like at the mid-season finale. And then he doesn't really show up again until like the very last episode, where he's holding Debbie and Oliver hostage. And then we get to see it's a brutal and pretty intense confrontation between him and Mark, where we get to see Angstrom's, multiverse portal abilities on full display, as he's literally hurling Mark through different multiverses. But at the same time, I really wanted to see more of this character. He was an interesting character, and seeing like his tragic backstory, where in every other alternate version of himself, Mark was bad. He turns bad. Like, we see versions where Angstrom is reliving the deaths of like alternate versions of himself, and it's like, to see him go through that, I really wanted to see that fleshed out more. And again, I didn't read the comics, so maybe it is in the comic story, I don't know, but in the show it feels like they kind of just gloss over that. And for a character like this, I really wanted to see more of that, because it felt like they were definitely building him up to be kind of the main villain of this season, and he's really not in it much. He's in it, the only character who's really in it less is probably Nolan, and he's only in like maybe, well, really that one episode on Thraxia. Other than that, he has small little bit parts in this season. So yeah, for being the main villain, I was definitely kind of disappointed with how little Angstrom was in it. And then also too, and the big spoiler of course, he seemingly gets killed by Mark at the very end of the season. Now, I will give the show credit. This scene where Mark beats Angstrom to death was a nice reversal of the last scene in the first season, where Nolan does the same thing to Mark. We get to see that nice juxtaposition between those two scenes. So that was interesting. I think it also kind of shows that Mark still has kind of PTSD compared, like, from what happened to him, from his fight with his father. So we kind of see that playing out here. And also, too, we get to see the emotional turmoil that Mark goes through, kind of knowing that he's actually just straight up murdered somebody, or at least he thinks he has. Now, again, I know what Angstrom does in the comics. I know what's coming, what I assume is going to be playing out in the next season, which I'll just go ahead and say, the Invincible Wars. Like, I know part of Angstrom's plan is that he wants to bring in Marks from other universes to fight our Mark, Alpha Mark, basically. So I know that's, and Angstrom, at least I believe, he's not really dead, technically, but the show makes it look like he is. But yeah, like, and seeing Mark struggle with that, thinking that he killed somebody, and you even see him like, out loud trying to justify it, It does make for a powerful scene, but again, I wanted to see more of this villain, and I just felt like we didn't get much of him. Now, maybe in season 3, maybe we'll get more of Angstrom, maybe we'll get to see, more of his character, but I don't know. From what I understand from the comics, it sounds like it pretty much kind of moves into the Invincible Wars and then Conquest. Beyond that, I don't really know. I don't know how much more impact Angstrom has on the story. So I was a little disappointed in that aspect, if I'm being perfectly honest. Also, I really wanted to see more of Nolan in this part. We get, like I said, we get snippets of him on the Viltrum ship. We get to see the torture scenes where he's being beaten. There is kind of that funny scene where he unites with Alan, who's definitely juiced up in this scene, or in this part of the season. Again, I knew Alan wasn't dead. I knew from the comics that he comes back. I don't think that was really much of a shock, but yeah, seeing him come back and then seeing the serious like power boost that he got from getting his ass beat in the first episode, or the first part of the season, like that was really cool. And something else I've got to talk about, I've got to bring it up, is the character of Anissa, who shows up in episode 7, I think. I do remember her from the comic. She's kind of an infamous character for reasons that, I'll probably get into later if it plays out in the show like that. But yeah, I know she's arguably one of the most hated characters, I think, in the comics. At least that's my understanding. And seeing her in this, I liked how they handled her character. I think they did a pretty good job of, like, I watched the scene in the comic when she shows up too, and I think for the most part they did a pretty good job of capturing that in the show. They did make one interesting little change, though. In the show, instead of Debbie being the one that Anissa threatens, it's actually Amber. And I actually think that works a little bit better in terms of the story, because one thing that they show throughout the season is that Mark is trying desperately to rebuild his relationship with Amber from season 1. He's trying to be the good boyfriend, to be there for her. And that's a pretty big part of the second season. Like seeing Mark trying to balance his romantic life with his superhero life. And then the two of them finally get a date. They finally get some time together. And of course, it's interrupted by yet another villain of Invincible, and it's Anissa this time. And it is such a creepy, subtle, but effective scene where she just shows up. She's very diplomatic with Mark, but she straight up just threatens to rip Amber's head off if he doesn't do what she says. And one thing that I really like about this is I think this is the very first time, well, outside of the Rhiannon and the college scene from the first season, I think this is the first time that we really see Amber straight up being threatened, like her life being threatened by one of Mark's enemies. And I feel like this was definitely like the big moment for Mark where he realized like he can't do it anymore. And that's a major decision that he has to wrestle with in this season, which I did like. He has to wrestle with basically accepting the fact that either he can be a superhero or he can try to be a normal person, but he can't do both. And we kind of see him make that decision in this one to fully commit himself to being invincible. The confrontation with him and Anissa is definitely a great scene to me. It was one of the most tense moments in the entire season because like Mark's being monitored by Cecil and the others. And one thing that I like is that they're analyzing Anissa, and they even tell Mark just straight up, like based on her bone density and muscle structure, like we anticipate that you've got like an 18% chance of beating her. Like they're communicating this to Mark in his earpiece as he's trying to talk to her. And they're basically telling him straight up, like just keep her talking, man. Don't fight her. Like, and really when you stop and think about it, not just for Mark, but for Cecil and all the other humans, this has got to be a pants-shittingly scary moment. Because they're probably all thinking about season 1. They're all just thinking like, okay, we all know how this went with Nolan back in, I think, what was it, Chicago or whatever, in the first season. It's like, we can't do this. Like, she's basically about as strong as Nolan. If she goes nuts, she's going to bitch slap Mark all over the damn planet. And Cecil even makes the remark, like when they're talking about weapons and stuff, he basically says like, yeah, we don't have a lot of good options. We're basically worthless here. Like if Mark can't stop her, we're basically screwed. It's definitely a scary moment, and I think it does a good job of kind of showing you just how terrifying superheroes can be from the perspective of a normal human. Like in movies and shows, you usually only see it from the perspective of like, Spider-Man or Iron Man or Thor and stuff, and you see it from their perspective, but very seldom do you see it from the perspective of just like some innocent bystander who's just kind of hanging out. Because to them, it's like, okay, these people are basically gods. If they decide to kill me, I'm dead. There ain't nothing my ass can do about it. So But yeah, that whole scene with Anissa, I thought that was done very well. I think it follows for the most part, it's pretty much beat for beat like it is in the comic. I also like how she just, compared to other Viltrumites that Mark's encountered so far, she's actually the most diplomatic, at least up to this point. Like, she tries to reason with Mark, she tries to talk to him, she tries to throw logic at him, and she even says, like, yeah, if you just let the Viltrumites take over Earth, like, we can help you, like, we'll make your job easier, like, there's no reason for you to not work with us. And of course Mark still refuses, which pisses her off even more. And I was kind of thinking about that, like, when Mark kept saying no to her, because even Cecil was kind of saying, like, dude, just say the damn words and we'll work together to figure something out, just get her to leave. And Mark kept saying no. I was kind of thinking about that, like, why he kept saying no, and I think it kind of comes down to two reasons. At least this is kind of my theory. I think, one, because that's just who Mark is. He doesn't know who she is, and for all he knows, she could be lying. Like, as soon as he agrees, she could just decide to kill him and take out the humans anyway. I think Mark wants to prevent the Viltrumites from taking over Earth as much as possible, so that's why he's just going to refuse her at every turn. But another reason that I think he said no is because I think Mark probably knows that the Viltrumites see strength as, like, the greatest asset. So I think in his mind, if he comes off as too subservient and willing to do what they say, they might see him as weak. I mean, in the first season, I think Nolan literally tells Mark that the Viltrumites had a civil war and basically slaughtered the weakest ones. So maybe in Mark's mind, maybe he thinks, obeying her every word might give him the impression of might give off the impression of him being too weak, and it might tempt the other Viltrumites to kill him. I don't know, just kind of a theory that I have about that. But yeah, we get to see Mark get slapped around by Anissa a little bit, like yet another Viltrumite. Like, Mark just can't get a break. He is just constantly getting his ass kicked. But then she decides to leave and basically tells Mark, like, you better come to your senses. She basically gives him that threat. And she says, like, if soon another will take my place, which I assume that is supposed to be Conquest. So I'll get into that character when and if he's introduced in the show. I'm sure it will be. He's a pretty major character in the comics. But yeah, overall, I've really enjoyed season 2. I think it's handled a lot of the major story beats from the comics very well, at least from what I know about them. But like I said, I think compared to season 1, I think season 1 I liked a little bit more. 2's been really good, but it's had there's a lot of like side stories going on. And while I definitely think the writers have done a pretty good job of handling everything, I do kind of wish there were times like where they would try to focus on Mark's story a little bit more. Like, we get like some of the scenes like with Debbie and stuff where like she's trying to find a babysitter for Oliver. I'm going to be honest, those were probably the moments where I was the least invested in what was going on. It's not that they're bad or anything like that. It's just, compared to everything else that's going on, it kind of feels like there's bigger stakes at hand. And, it would have been one thing if they showed like Oliver maybe like developing his powers a little bit more or developing more, since he's supposed to age faster being half Thraxan, but we don't really get that. So I don't know. Ultimately, they add good character development for Debbie for the most part, but I kind of feel like we got a lot of that in the first part of season 1. Like, these scenes to me kind of felt like her scenes, at least with Oliver and stuff, at least in my opinion, kind of felt like that was where the second part of the season was kind of at its slowest. I just kind of found myself not caring quite as much. I guess I just kind of wish that season 2 focused just a tad bit more on like Mark and the coalition of planets and kind of what was going on there. Again, I know this is supposed to be kind of setting up major pieces for what's to come in season 3, whenever that comes out. Hopefully it won't be too long. But yeah, it felt like to me overall, season 1 was probably a little bit more focused, and I think because of that, I enjoyed it a bit more. I wanted to see more of Angstrom. Hopefully we'll get more of him in the future, but just, we don't really get a lot of him. We kind of get pieces of what he's doing. We kind of see a little bit of like him setting up the trap for Invincible, but we don't get a lot of details on that. And I would have liked to have seen more of that. And also too, I'm just going to be honest, when Mark and Amber do eventually break up, I was kind of waiting for it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think they've done a good job of making Amber's character a lot more likable and supportive of Mark in season 2. But it kind of felt like we all sort of knew it was coming. It seemed like that was what at least this part of the season was kind of building towards, was that Mark and Amber were going to inevitably split up. And it's sort of, I don't know, it just kind of like they were going through the motions. In the scene where she finally does break up with Mark, like after the confrontation with Anissa, I just found myself watching it just kind of thinking like, yeah, I mean, I kind of knew this was coming, so hopefully we'll see more of her character in season 3. I think she has somewhat of a smaller role in the comics from what I remember. Honestly, I'm not too sure, but like I said, overall, I liked Amber's character in this season. I like that she was more supportive of Mark, like going with him to Comic-Con and all that stuff. But yeah, like their relationship kind of felt like, again, kind of the weaker parts of the story. Like every time any episode kind of focused on their relationship, I understand the purpose of it, but it just kind of felt like it slows down the momentum a tad. So yes, for me at least, whenever the story focused a little bit too much on some of the side plots going on, well, I guess that wasn't a side plot, it's part of Mark's story, but it really doesn't have much to do with like the Viltrumite confrontation. Anytime it didn't really focus on that storyline, I kind of found myself a little bit checked out. The stuff with the Guardians, really enjoyed. But like I said, overall, I think Season 2 has been a really good act to follow Season 1. Like, if I had to give it a letter grade, I'd probably give it, like, B+, A-, something like that. Like, Season 1, I would definitely give a solid A, and this would probably be just, like, maybe a slight dip. Like, not quite as strong as the first season, just because it feels like the plot's a little bit more all over the place. Not, like, in a way where it feels messy or, completely unfocused, but it just feels like there's a lot going on, and it would have been nice if we could have focused more on, like, the A and B plots and not so much the C, D, and E plots, so... but overall, yeah, still a solid follow-up to the first season. And it genuinely has me excited for what's to come in Season 3. So yeah, overall, the Invincible series, still really good. I thought I saw somewhere that they're planning on doing a live-action either movie or show. I mean, I guess I'd be more on board with a movie. A show seems kind of weird since we've already got an animated show. And I feel like for a story like this, animated seems like the better route to go. There's a lot of superhero stuff out right now. I know that there's the X-Men 97 series, which I do plan on watching at some point. I've been thinking about renewing my Disney Plus subscription and, like, going back and watching the old animated X-Men series from the 90s, like, from beginning to end. I used to watch it way back in the day when I was a kid, but, I mean, if you were to ask me now, like, what happened, I couldn't tell you. Like, I just watched it when it was on TV, like, what was it, Fox something? Like, was it, like... Didn't Fox used to have like a cartoon channel or station or something like that? I can't remember. Like Fox Kids? Is that what I think? Am I thinking of something else? I can't remember. I am so tired right now. I can't think straight. But yeah, like I've thought about going back and rewatching that. I've heard you don't need to watch X-Men 97, so I'm not sure yet. It's like, I looked it up and I think the original series is like 70 some odd episodes, which sounds like quite a bit. I may do that, and if I do, I might do a review of that as well. But to kind of give a heads up for what's going to come in the next episode, I did just finish Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on the PlayStation 5, so I'll be giving my spoiler-filled review of that in the next episode, so if you want to hear about that, then tune in. But for now, I think that's going to conclude tonight's episode. Once again, I am on Anchor, Spotify, and YouTube. If you like what you heard, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time. Later.